As F1 fans, we all love a good comeback, don't we? Especially if it's to do with a world champion coming back into the fray after a few years in the wilderness. And we had it just a few years ago with Fernando Alonso, but this isn't just a recent occurrence, it's been going on for quite some time now. But most notably, one that really stands out for myself is when Jordan almost tempted back Nigel Mansell for 1997. Now on the surface, Mansell's test with Jordan was nothing more than a PR stunt to appease their giant title sponsors, Benson and Hedges. And at the time, this blew my 8-year-old mind because I was a massive Jordan fan and I'd read all the books and watched all the videos about Nigel Mansell, just missed out his F1 career, but finally, these two worlds were going to come together. So in order to unpack this fully, we need to wind the clock back to 1996. The engines were big, the rulebook was small, and teams had proper sponsors by the sort of businesses and companies that you actually recognised. And also the likes of Verstappen, Piastri, Norris and Russell and Leclerc, they weren't even born yet, which is slightly concerning. And you know the Aston Martin F1 team of today? Well, back in 1996, they were known as Jordan Grand Prix. And they had to join the front runners, they had a lot of growing up to do, and they had to make that step up somehow. Now, they were just off the back of a somewhat disappointing 1996 season and really had to create some buzz with Benson and Hedges, their title sponsor, to excite them about the upcoming 97 season, as thus to secure their long-term commitment. But the problem was, Benson and Hedges wanted a famous name, a blockbuster name, a world champion, but the problem was none were available. After all, at the time, Michael Schumacher had an ironclad contract with Ferrari. Damon Hill had just signed on to Arrows on the promise of a competitive car with Tom Wilkinshaw Racing's involvement, and the rest were ruled out because of retirement or even tragedy, apart from one man from Birmingham who was a world champion and also had a moustache. Nigel Mansell had just walked away from F1 in 1995 after just 2 Grand Prix with McLaren. Nigel didn't fit in the car, McLaren and himself didn't fit each other, and it was just kind of a sad end to such a strong a memorable F1 career. Even to this day, seeing Mansell in McLaren gear just doesn't seem right, like it just doesn't compute. But interestingly, that McLaren and Mansell relationship was brought around by Philip Morris, owners of the Marlboro brand. And again, they wanted a blockbuster driver, but it was an arranged marriage that both parties were actually very happy to bring to an end. But as they had done with McLaren, whatever the title sponsor wants, the title sponsor gets, and Eddie Jordan made the call. He invited the 43-year-old Mansell for a tour of the factory at Silverstone, and then talked him into a test drive. But bear in mind though, Fernando Alonso is 43 years old today, but he is light years ahead in terms of conditioning, fitness, nutrition, all that modern stuff that keeps an older F1 driver going. But despite that though, Alonso hasn't had the same body-breaking F1 experience that Nigel had back in the 80s and 90s. And also you can throw in his shunter IndyCar and also touring cars on top of that. But on this tour of the factory following his conversation with Eddie, Nigel was very impressed with the facilities, and he all quite liked the sound of this. He liked where it was going. Now in hindsight, from Nigel's perspective, you can't really blame him for entertaining this kind of thing. After all, he was still such a massive name in motorsport, particularly in the UK, and he probably saw this as a good chance to clear his name after that dreadful spell with McLaren. And also he was adamant that he was still in good shape and still had the hunger and will to be competitive in Formula 1 under the right circumstances. And so he dusted off the red, white and blue helmet, jumped on a plane to Barcelona to where the post-season testing was taking place. And surprisingly, over this testing period, he actually did a pretty good job with his best lap, falling just 3/10 behind a young and keen Ralf Schumacher. Jordan designer Gary Anderson has mentioned on numerous occasions that over the radio towards the end, Mansell mentioned that his hands were cold and he needs to come in for a cup of tea. And you can't really argue with that. At least he was being honest. Now at this point, the signs showed that the speed was still there, but whether he can be competitive over a race distance, let alone a full F1 calendar, was still the question. But overall, both parties seemed to be quite satisfied with the performance. However, at the time, Ralf Schumacher was not impressed, and he was quoted as saying, "At his age, I'd be doing something different." Meaning that he would rather just sit in a chair, which is pretty much kind of what he's doing now. But most importantly, especially with Eddie Jordan and the marketing side of things with Benson and Hedges, the news of Mansell doing the test was all over the newspapers and the media, displaying, of course, in all their glory, those big Benson and Hedges logos for all the world to see. At least if the test wasn't a success, the marketing campaign behind it definitely was. And shortly after the Barcelona test, the conversation started to move away from introductions and swing towards the business of of money and contracts and potentially even a drive for 1997. Now, although Mansell was still very much an unknown quantity at this stage and no one really knew what level he was at during a Grand Prix, he was still asking for a £5 million a year contract, which adjusted for inflation today is about £12 million or $15 million. And that is roughly the same amount as what Lando Norris is being paid by McLaren today. And if Mansell joined the grid today with that amount of money, he would be the 5th highest earner on the grid. Now, that's a fair amount of money for a young talent such as Norris in 2024, but in 1996, for an unknown talent such as Mansell, who didn't really have a good record following him in recent years, that kind of money was absolutely insane. But at the time though, Mansell still had a following and could still make headlines. And where he went, business followed, so that £5 million a year contract, you could say, was still justified. But then Eddie Jordan, with the financial security of his team as absolute paramount, he knew that paying out £5 million may not be the wisest investment and sought assistance from the likes of Bernie Ecclestone and ITV to help pay what Nigel was asking for. And it wasn't outside the realms of possibility either, because Bernie was instrumental financially with bringing Mansell back to the sport for that short stint in 1994 with Williams. And in the UK, ITV had just won the rights to broadcast Formula One from the BBC, so it's safe to say that they probably had a fair amount of budget at their disposal. And after all, they needed ratings, and Mansell in the UK would definitely help with that. But unfortunately, for the same doubts that Eddie was having, no guarantees on performance, driver who's pretty much past it, Bernie and ITV decided to turn him down. So an alternative had to try and be found. But after much thought and speculation and global interest, Mansell ultimately decided against returning for the 1997 season, no matter how much he was going to be paid. But also you have to think, Nigel Mansell had been retiring on and off from F1 since about 1990, and after being a Formula One world champion, an IndyCar world champion, what else did he have to prove? He still had his loyal fans, he was a blockbuster name across the world, and he was still able to race in motorsport, which was less of a commitment, and also they were probably quite happy to have him as well. But after all, he'd got the F1 bug out of his system with this test in Barcelona and realised it wasn't for him anymore, and probably decided he wanted a bit of a rest. Jordan eventually made what was the sensible decision and decided to sign Giancarlo Fisichella to partner Ralf Schumacher for the 1997 season. And as they say, the rest is history. Now, when you add everything up, from the stories, from the insights from everyone involved, and you take away the emotion and romance from it, it's difficult to see this whole thing as anything other than a PR stunt that got out of hand, but ultimately, it worked. It got Jordan and Mansell in the headlines, it gave Benson and Hedges what they wanted, and also it created some excitement ahead of the 97 season. And on a wider scale, the Mansell situation delayed a possible Martin Brundle and Jordan contract extension, which then led Brundle to cut his losses and focus full-time on commentating, exactly where he is today. And it also gave us the delight of watching a young Giancarlo Fisichella darting around in his yellow Jordan with that snake face decal on the nose. That bitten and hisses Jordan, is there a livery which is more cool than that? Please let me know in the comments if you can even think of one. But amazingly, this wasn't the end for Mansell and Jordan, because in 2004 he drove that year's Jordan car in a publicity F1 event in central London. And even in 2004, with Jordan having the likes of Nick Heidfeld and Timo Glock on the books, having Mansell in the car at London was still the better attraction. Now, despite all the hundreds or thousands of what-if stories in Formula One, to me anyway, this one remains one of the most fascinating because of the lead up to it and potentially what might have happened over the course of the season. And it's especially interesting when you consider where Jordan was at the time and when Mansell was at the time. And I know this does sound a bit odd, but sometimes in F1 it's the things that don't happen that are sometimes the most memorable. But the question is, how do you think this tie-up would have gone? Would Mansell and Jordan have been a success? Would it have been a repeat of Mansell and McLaren back in 1995? Let me know in the comments below. And also, let me know if you have a favourite of a potential tie-up that almost happened that you'd like me to cover later down the line. But just on a serious note very quickly, it was a real shock to hear about Eddie Jordan's recent health complications. From the podcast that he does with David Coulthard, and I know this is just a small little F1 YouTube channel and everything, but from myself and hopefully from all the subscribers and followers and everything, just to send Eddie best wishes and hope you get well soon. And of course, as always, I'm Paul, this is the Gridgab, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Cheers.